Hello, I'm John Allure. Before you listen to this episode, a couple of things. These are podcasts from the first season of Who Killed Teresa. They haven't been heard in over 4 years. They're raw. It took me a while to develop a style. A lot of people like them that way, unvarnished. Others commented that it was amateurish. Nonetheless, here they are, unedited. I haven't gone back and listened to them. I haven't cleaned them up. Thanks for listening, and once again, life isn't fair, justice is blind and dysfunctional, and some cops aren't smart and dedicated like on television. This is Who Killed Teresa.
This is Who Killed Teresa. One of my daughters asked me, she said, "Dad, did you get that blue small snowball mic really for us to do a podcast? Or were you always intending to do your own podcast? What's the deal here?" And the truth is, no, I did want them to do a podcast. It was going to be called Board Game. And this was the premise. Each week, my 3 daughters would spend an episode playing a different vintage board game. Now, I thought this was funny because they knew nothing about this world. These are kids raised on Nintendo and Super Mario Brothers. So they would take a game like, certainly they knew Monopoly. They'd take a game like Careers or Masterpiece, some of those classic Parker Brothers games. And they would, in the course of a 30-minute episode, dissect it, play it, and then, of course, brutally criticize it with the great amount of humor that my daughters have. And I had actually great aspirations for this. I had a lineup of games. In addition to, we were going to start with the easy ones, and then we were going to move on to such classics from the 70s as Bermuda Triangle, Bigfoot, the board game, the Bobbsey Twins. There's one called The Exciting New Game of the Kennedys, the Love Boat Game, Kresgen's ESP, Mr. T, Sergeant Preston of the RCMP game, the Barney Miller game. So we would go through all of these games to great hilarity. And we'd even done a pilot episode over the Christmas holiday in experimenting with podcasts. I had actually recorded them playing the Partridge Family game. If you remember, some of us were raised on the Brady Bunch and some of us were raised on the Partridge Family. We were a Partridge Family household, so that's how we rolled. And so they played this game, and it was all right. We had about a 15-minute recording, but I managed to screw the whole thing up. I couldn't get it to work right. I eventually accidentally deleted the tape, and I called time and said, you know what, I'm going to figure this out on my own first, and then when I become really good at doing this, I will then more professionally put it together with my daughters. I was really looking forward to the Kennedy game, which is, if you see it, it's, obviously all of these things are variations on the same game. You roll the dice, you take a piece of plastic, you move it around the squares. And the Kennedy game is, if you want to go look at it, it's so obviously a ripoff of Clue, only in a more Kennedy-esque political way. So it's like, oh, you can go to the library and I don't know, have cocktails with Joe Kennedy. Go into the scullery and, I don't know, bang the office assistant. It's this kind of absurdity that I thought they could be really, really popular. And, it would just, it would go viral and take off, much like a McElroy's Brothers podcast. It was going to be it was going to be an all-girls version of My Brother and Me. And they'd have this successful tool. They could even do it while they were out of town. They could, while one of them was away at college. Once a week they could get together and they'd create this product and then release it, and it would, as I say, it would be immensely popular. Well, of course, you now know the story. It never unfolded that way. There was so much inertia. I could never really corral them all together in order to get a concerted effort of them doing this. They gradually lost interest. I lost interest, and you're now stuck with Who Killed Teresa instead of board game.
We play these parlor games. We play it make-believe. When we get to the part where I say that I'm gonna leave, everybody loves a happy ending, but we don't even try. We go straight past pretending to the part where everybody loves to cry.
Teresa Lohr was a 19-year-old Canadian college student who disappeared on Friday, November 3rd, 1978, from Champlain College, Lennoxville, in the eastern townships of Quebec. 5 months later, on April 13th, 1979, her body was discovered in a small body of water approximately 1 kilometer from her dormitory residence in Compton. Upon her disappearance, police initially suggested she was a runaway. When her body was discovered, police then suggested she was the possible victim of a drug overdose, perhaps with the assistance of fellow college students. In the summer of 2002, the family of Teresa Lohr enlisted the support of an investigative reporter and friend, Patricia Pearson, who produced a series of articles for Canada's National Post newspaper that presented compelling evidence that Teresa Lohr was the victim of murder and that the death was possibly linked to 2 other unsolved local cases. Who Killed Teresa is a podcast that investigates 15 unsolved murders from 1975 to 1981 which may be associated. These related cases are the cases of Sharon Pryor, Lise Choquette, Louise Cameron, Jocelyn Houle, Chantal Tremblay, Joanne Dorian, Helen Monast, Catherine Hawkes, Denise Bazinet, Manon Dubé, Lison Blais, Teresa Lohr, Nicole Gaudreau, Tammy Leakey, and Joanne Lemieux. Alors, je suis inquiète. Inquiète it's a French word. It means exactly what you might think it means. In quiet. I am in quiet. I am unsettled. I am anxious. My daughter texted me this week. She's nervous. She's going into her senior year, and her AP French class is apparently really, really difficult. She says, "J'adore Mademoiselle Campbell, mais je suis inquiète, très inquiète." To which I replied, "Inquiète, c'est mon meilleur mot en français." To which she replied, "MDR." MDR is the French equivalent of LOL, laugh out loud. Mort de rire, it means. These things. I want to talk a little bit about my friend, Pierre Boisvenu. Now, I think in bits and pieces I've discussed Pierre before, but we're going to pack the whole thing together and we'll revisit some areas, but we'll come to, you'll get to my point as we near the end. So, Pierre Boisvenu, born in Quebec, lifelong civil servant in Quebec. I believe he worked for the Department of Interior, and then bang, 2002. a convicted sex offender who was out, named Hugues Boisvenu, murders Pierre's daughter, Julie Boisvenu. In his defense, he says he was having sex in her car when his hand slipped and fell on her neck, and he accidentally choked her to death. This began the process of Pierre's activation as an advocate for victims' rights. So at this time, 2002, you find Pierre beginning to plant the seeds of a local grassroots organization in Quebec for victims advocacy, it's now known as AVPAD, and roughly translates to Association of Families of Murdered and Missing Persons. At this time, when I heard of what happened to Pierre, I reached out to him. And I think we've talked about this before. I reached out to him because the Canadian government was having what they were labeling, what Justice Canada was labeling as the first ever victims conference. It was called Moving Forward, Lessons Learned from Victims of Crime. And as I have said, it included some victims, the right victims, the victims who could be corralled to push a certain message that would be attractive and useful to the Ministry of Justice in Canada. But it didn't sit right with me, nor did I think it would sit right with this person named Pierre Boisvenu. So I contacted him and I said, do you know that the Canadian government is having this conference, national conference in Ottawa? He said, what? I've never heard of it. I said, neither have I. I said, do you want to go? He goes, yeah, in protest. So on the eve of the conference, I met Pierre. I flew to Ottawa. We had arranged to meet in Hull. Now, if you know Ottawa is divided by the Ottawa River. On the Ottawa side is in Ontario, largely English. The French side of Ottawa is Hull. The other side of the river, it resides in Quebec. And Hull is, by reputation, Hull was always where you went if you wanted to have any fun in Ottawa. Back in the day, Ottawa was quite stiff. It would close up at 11 o'clock. So if you wanted to party and have a drink, you go to Hull. I'm sure that's changed somewhat. But nevertheless, the symbolic significance of Pierre wanting to have our first meeting together in a restaurant in Hull, not in Ottawa, was not lost on me. And believe me, if you know anything about people who are used to playing the game of Quebec and Canadian politics, symbology is tremendously important to them. They know when when they're taking the piss out of you, and Pierre certainly is very good at playing that chess match. So I knew what this meant. So we go to Hull, we meet. I meet this guy who's probably 15, if not 20 years older than me. Tremendous energy, tremendously compelling, and we form this game strategy. We're gonna approach the plenary on the next morning, the plenary address for the opening of the conference. And he came up with this game plan. He's like, I'm going to be on the mic, audience left. You're going to be on the mic, audience right. There are two mics addressing sort of the main plenary platform. And I'm going to say, my name is Pierre Boisvenu. I'm here in protest to this conference. You do not speak for Julie Boisvenu. The family speaks for Julie Boisvenu. And then I would, in kind, he would do this in French, and then in English I would say, my name is John Allure. You do not speak for Teresa Allure. Only the family speaks for Teresa Allure. And such our partnership in victim advocacy in Canada was born. Now, it was in the aftermath at some of the events, some of the breakout sessions at the conference that I began to meet other people, and they sort of took an interest in certainly in Pierre, but particularly in me. I think there was a sense that maybe they could tame this guy, maybe get him to settle down and bring him into the fold. So it's there where I met my friend Carolyn, who she's a forensics specialist who worked at Simon Fraser University at the time, and was one of the chief people responsible for the Robert Pickton recovery site with those horrible murders. I met Priscilla de Villiers, whose daughter, I believe, she was murdered at a Toronto tennis club. I believe she was shot by a boyfriend or a close friend. I met Debbie Mahaffey, the mother of Leslie Mahaffey, who was absolutely outraged that she had to read in the paper that this conference was even going on, and kind of hightailed it to Ottawa to see what was going on, because she of all people remember that Paul Bernardo, Carla Homolka were still at this time, 2003, very fresh in the Canadian public imagination, and this so prominent a victim had not even been bothered to be invited. Again, I think a lot of it is because some of us can be rather strident in our opinions, and or at this time, they didn't want us around. We might say something that would offend. God forbid that we would do such a thing. Slowly from this, as I said before, we in 2004 started a group called CAVA, Canadian Association for Victims Assistance. Had a conference in, I believe we had one in Toronto and one in Vancouver. Vancouver first, then in Mississauga, actually. The group fractured. It couldn't hold. Pierre was invited into it in the Vancouver exercise, and the people. I couldn't believe we were back in this time where there was such a level of mistrust. That Ontario doesn't trust the West doesn't trust Ontario, no one trusts Quebec, and so the whole thing fractured and fell apart. But one of the lessons I learned from this was how quickly people who are hurt by these tragedies, they quickly latch on to the first thing that represents their very special interest. So in the case of Priscilla de Villiers, because her daughter was murdered with a gun, with a revolver, she was going to be all about about gun restriction and gun rights, or the opposite of gun rights. In my case, I was certainly going to my first interest was going to be about cold cases and getting a cold case squad, and so that's where my level of advocacy started. And then with Pierre, he was, I don't mean to sound cruel here, but he was strongly focused on the punishment of the offender. I don't think it was lost to me that as soon as Bernier was convicted and incarcerated, Pierre became very, very focused on these prisons not becoming a club fed or Camp Cupcake kind of information or kind of environment, that we were going to strip them of any amenities in those institutions. If they were having luxury counseling and access to their own televisions and the finest foods, I don't mean the finest foods, but anything that even suggested a level of comfort, that he was going to advocate for taking that away. And I don't even know on what level Pierre was even aware of that. We've never really discussed this or had that conversation, but for me there was a real sense that Hugo Bernier, do you think I was finished when I did all my advocacy to make sure you would be locked up for a minimum of 25 years? you haven't seen the worst of it. I'm going to make your life in prison a living hell for all of those 25 years for what you did to my daughter, Julie. So obviously this punitive angle that Pierre was pursuing became very, very attractive to the conservative government that was at that time in power. And at the then Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, quickly brought Pierre into his wing and used him for his own for the party's own conservative policies as a spokesman for it. Pierre quickly became a senator. He is now Senator Boisvenu, which in Canada is a lifetime appointment, somewhat controversially. And Pierre even slowly became associated with the Tea Party, sort of like a Canadian Tea Party voice. And I've never really discussed Pierre's politics with him because he's a friend. I know he absolutely, I'll say this because I know it, despises Trudeau. Any French Canadian is naturally suspicious of the Trudeau families. Understand that it is Justin's father when he was in power for the 12 years that he was in power. Pierre, there are two things. You got to be careful to distinguish them: a federalist and a nationalist in terms of the Quebec perspective. A federalist wants Quebec to be under within the fold of Canada, and a nationalist in Quebec is obviously somebody who wants greater independence, right up to the extreme of full sovereignty, separatism. What angered a lot of French people in the 70s is Quebec's insistence that they were, a unique culture, a unique society in Canada, and one of the most distinctive things that made them so special was their language, to which Trudeau said, well, that's fine. I'm going to make French and English the official languages across Canada, particularly within the federal government. That's how I'll handle that. I'll level the playing field. This pissed off Quebec like you wouldn't believe. Don't think that made anyone happy. They wanted to be special, and Trudeau took that away from them. So there's a long history of animosity that continued through the years, the Paul Ryan years of the Liberals, the Jean Chrétien years of the Liberals. They were always seen as Federalist Liberals, not the friend of the Quebec that wanted greater independence. So I'm fairly confident on my what Pierre's opinion would be on Justin Trudeau, and in fact he's not shy about it. He's very vocal on social media in taking every opportunity to take a knock at Justin. Now, as I say, so in a lot of respects, Pierre's advocacy initially was operating in his own special interest. He wanted to punish criminals, and that initially became a lot of what his organization in Quebec, AVPAD, what its advocacy initially was all about. And this frustrated a lot of people. Naturally, there were a lot of people in line wanting their interest represented. As I say, specifically, I wanted more about unsolved murders. There was a whole contingent, because it had happened so recently, the biker wars in Quebec between the Rock Machine and the 81s, the Hells Angels, had unfolded, and there was this aftermath of the survivors of those wars, the people who were maimed in bombings, etc., lining up and saying, no, you got to represent our interests first. And then shortly I began to learn that it was unrealistic to always be operating in your own interest, that at a certain point you did need to get in line and have a collective front and to advance a few things and move the needle on those few things, and then maybe we could move on to other things. But it didn't play out that way, actually. But I slowly lost, frankly, interest in AFPAD. They weren't moving fast enough in my interest. Eventually, we did get a cold case unit. We did get these cases up on the Sûreté de Québec's website. And then I immediately had a dialogue with the Sûreté de Québec at the highest level. So my interests were frankly satisfied. So I didn't take a whole lot of interest in Pierre's cause. From there, I guess Senator Boisvenu's trajectory reached its apex when he suggested I think it was right around 2012, that murderers in Canadian prisons should be given a rope with which to hang themselves. And obviously this outraged the Liberals, and the far right absolutely loved it. He made somewhat of a conditional apology on it. He backed off on a little bit. But people in the United States, well, I think globally, will certainly recognize this sort of rhetoric as something being born out of recent years living in this world. And Pierre embraced it and certainly didn't shy away from it. I will add some things because I have to, because if you go and research Pierre, you'll go, oh, this guy isn't so great after all. Well, so you might as well just hear it from me. And Pierre is human, is what he is. So yes, when he became a senator, did he fall victim somewhat to the attractions of material things? Certainly. Pierre was wrapped up in a minor way in the whole Mike Duffy scandal. Mike Duffy is a politician who's accused of basically using federal funds for his own personal purposes. This is not uncommon. Having two residences, one in Ottawa, one in Prince Edward Island. Did he really need both of them, and why was taxpayers paying for both? This certainly played out with Pierre on a minor scale. He had a residence in Sherbrooke, Quebec. He had a residence in Ottawa. Was he taking advantage of the taxpayer? And then it furthered on into the questions began to surface about his secretary, who was significantly younger than Pierre and who he was obviously in a relationship with at the time. And was this appropriate? Was this really the best choice for his administrative assistant, etc.? It all played out in a very ugly fashion in the newspapers. I'll leave my personal feelings of that out. I will say that I will say this. I have not met his fiancée. She no longer is in his employ with the federal government, but they're still in a relationship. I knew his former wife, Diane. And very, very sadly, that marriage broke up. And it wasn't only about the murder of Julie Boisvenu. 2 years after 2002, his youngest daughter in 2004, Isabelle, was killed tragically in a highway accident, along with her then boyfriend. So Pierre and Diane lost a lot, and I'm not gonna judge his behavior. I'm in no position to do it. I think it's sad that his marriage broke up, and I identify with it because, frankly, my marriage broke up, not unassociated with events having to do with this cause and advocacy. Pierre remains a senator. He's still fighting the fight. He is still what I would say right of center. I'd place myself center. I'm not really. I mean, I was raised by a mother and father who were certainly a mother who was a Trudeau fanatic. And I certainly went through my phase of that, but I've always put myself center in anything. I don't trust any politician. I never will. And my pedigree, as you might imagine, with anything in life, is trust but verify. So I'm not going to drink the Kool-Aid of any political party and roll with it at all. But then I still have this friend, Pierre. I'll leave you with one story about Pierre Hugues Boisvenu. And forgive me if I told it before, but I find in the telling, you always tell it a little bit differently. It's a very iterative process. I mean, I've been telling these stories for years, and every time I retell it, it gets reframed, it gets reshaped. So it's this. I tagged along with Pierre one winter. He was giving a seminar at a night course on victimology to a group of criminology students at the University of Montreal. And so I tagged along with him to watch this 2-hour class on a Monday night or something like that. And as there's about 30 students in the class, and as they sauntered in, as they corralled in, Pierre greeted every single one of them at the door with a smile, and he made an effort. I watched him. He shook every one of their hands, and warmly and very embracingly brought them into this classroom. And believe me, this was not his crowd. A lot of them had opinions that were very, very different from his. And I think he was determined to set the stage in a positive manner. And I asked him later, I said, hey, what are you doing there when you do that? And he said, he said, what, when I'm shaking their hand? I said, yeah. He said, I'm taking their energy. I'm physically grabbing hold of their energy and bringing it into my world because it feeds me. It sustains me. And that's how we all got to be as a people, as a society, as civilization. He didn't say it in such a pretentious way, but he made his point very effectively. Incidentally, it's a holiday weekend here in the United States. That's why you're getting a twofer. That's why you're getting 2 episodes. And to add to that, my daughters are off doing something fun, so they're not here this weekend. So that's what's going on there. And I want to go back to some very old cases. And the point here is to learn just how little we've learned in the last 40 years. And if you go to the website, teresalore.com, it's actually the first, if you go to the website, I have 2 pieces of sticky content. The first is a catalog of 22 cases in French, and then right below it is it's the parallel catalog of cases. I think it's 21. There's a typo though. I have to fix it. I dropped a case on one of them. But anyway, it's sort of the mirror image in English of the same cases. And the first case I ever referenced on the site is the 1971 case of Alice Pare. I think that's how you pronounce it. There's no accent, so I don't think it's Alice Pare. Alice Pare. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And the reason I saved the first for last is there's, as I've said, chronologically, there's use in doing things that way, but I don't think you would have learned anything from hearing the Pare case first. I think you need to learn it or hear it last. And incidentally, when I constructed these series of cases on the website, the way I did it chronologically from in English from first to last. So from 71 to 81. And then in translating into French, I worked backwards. So I did the last case first and went back in time. And I did it that way because I thought there might be some value in seeing it frontwards and backwards. And I can't remember why, but there was a lot of value in that. So we'll look at the 1971 murder of Alice Pare and then the 1972 murder of Ursula Schulze. And the point is to shed some light on some of the cases we've been talking about. And I'm less interested in, as you know by now, linking these murders to the cases we've been discussing. They serve a greater point by demonstrating the lack of growth in Quebec criminal investigation in the last 40 years. Alice Pare was 14 when she disappeared walking home from a music lesson in Drummondville, Quebec on February 17, 1971. Around 5:30 p.m. that evening, she left the Pavillon de Musique at 466 Rue Saint-Jean and crossed the street with the intention of using a phone booth to call her mother to come pick her up. But for some reasons, she decides better of it, and she thinks, you know what, I'll walk the half mile home to where her parents lived at 667 Boulevard de Mercier. Pare was missing for 68 days. The SQ investigators included Detectives Allard, Cyr, Bibot. They were in charge of the missing persons portion of the investigation. But while the police, as we've seen in a lot of these cases, were kind of no doubt fumbling around looking for what they thought was a runaway, her family got it right. Within 2 weeks of her disappearance, her parents were convinced she'd been abducted and that her body would be found probably eventually in the snow. And they were right. On the morning of April 26, 1971, 3 workers with the farm of Alferge Leclerc at 3 Range de Saint-Clotilde de Horton near Victoriaville spotted a pair of white boots in a field about 60 feet from the gravel road. And when they got closer, they discovered the clothed body was that of Alice Pare, lying under a tree. Called to the scene were detectives Pepin, Cerruti, Villa, Vigneault, André Menard, all of the Victoriaville Sûreté de Québec. And also Jacques Gabory was detached from the SQ headquarters in Montreal. And also at the scene was a doctor, Jean-Paul Valcourt of the SQ's Montreal Laboratoire Médecine Légale. Now, Pare was found fully clothed in her school uniform. Her white winter coat had been removed and was near the body. She had been strangled. There was no evidence of sexual assault, and missing was her musical instrument from the day that she disappeared, a flute in a black case. That flute was discovered 3 days later next to Route 20 between Sainte-Clotilde and Saint-Albert, about a 10-minute drive from where her body was found. Now, this case was eventually handed over to Normand Bergeron of the Sûreté de Québec, Victoriaville, but little information ever came forward in the aftermath. Someone eventually claimed that they saw Pare getting into a vehicle, what was described as a 1970s 2-door Chevrolet, the evening of her disappearance. Now, jump forward to October 28th, 1975. the French tabloid Allo Police publishes an article that basically states that police are fishing for information. And in quotes, the police learned of certain persons who know the identity of the assassin. And all of you know this type of article. It's the type that the police do when they got nothing, right? They got nothing, so they say, we may have something, and the expression is they shake the tree, right? They shake the tree to see if anything can come forward, because what they have is a dead end in a true cold case. Now, by this time, the case had been moved to the Sûreté de Québec in Trois-Rivières. And if you're counting, as I know you are, that's at least 3 jurisdictions by this point in 1975 that have touched the case. It's now under the command of Raymond Ibert, and Ibert expresses this all too familiar Sûreté de Québec refrain that he felt certain that someone would come forward after all these years, but that no one ever did. As if, and I've heard this. I heard this in my sister's case. People would over time just miraculously come forward, and they'd phone or they'd call, or they'd come into the police headquarters and say, "Hey, remember that case?" Well, I feel like I want to talk about it. So he says he was certain someone would come forward, but no one ever did. However, he believes that things are moving rapidly now, and he's certain it will be resolved. Forgive me, it's my gallows humor there. You know how I truly feel about this. So to my knowledge, this 1971 case has never been solved. In fact, a number of years ago, a woman emailed me and said, I was a friend of Alice's. I never heard what happened to her. Was it solved? And I was like, well, how the heck would I know? That's why I'm reaching out. Was it? I have never specifically asked the Sûreté de Québec about this case, because it appears to me on first blush is such an outlier, and I frankly had bigger fish to fry. Perhaps I'll do that. But it is curious that the police waited so long on this case until 1975. And why 1975? Well, speculating, maybe the police were getting nervous. In the spring of that year, and this had just happened, is the case of Sharon Pryor. And she's found brutally murdered in as you know, in Longueuil, Quebec. And these crime scenes, if you were listening, are not dissimilar. Found 60 feet in the woods under a tree. Pare's body is very similarly staged in the same way that Jocelyn Houle was, in the same way that Sharon Pryor was. Quite chaotic. Coat removed and put to the side of the body. Well, that's Pryor. It's also Louise Camera. So my question is, did the police come forward at this point because they knew they were on the brink of something chaotic and something that was getting out of control? Something I find very interesting about Alice Pare was that she came from a very prominent legal family in Quebec. Her grandfather, Joseph Marier, was a judge. Her uncle, Marcel Marier, was a Montreal Municipal Court judge. Her other uncle, Elferge Marier, was a Superior Court judge. Her stepfather, Paul Chasse, was a lawyer in Drummondville. And with all that kind of clout, you'd have thought that there might have been enough influence to bring this matter to some level of justice. And the only thing I can think is perhaps it speaks to the disconnect that so commonly exists between law enforcement and the criminal justice court system, and that dysfunction is not uncommon in many places. So now, as I say, I want to turn to the other case I mentioned, Ursula Schulze from 1972. Now, slightly different, and by the way, the Drummondville, Victoriaville is, if you don't know, it is slightly east of Montreal, about 2 hours, an hour and a half, and slightly north of Sherbrooke, that Lennoxville, Sherbrooke, that area we had been talking about. So Ursula Schulze's case unfolds on the south shore of Montreal. It's called Brossard, but it's adjacent, not too far from Châteauguay, which we had talked about, the Châteauguay killer. And also it's very close to, if you go from south up, heading up the river north, you hit Longueuil. A 19-year-old Ursula Schulze was abducted at a bus stop in broad daylight on the morning of July 13th, 1972 in Brossard. The incident was witnessed by many people who watched a man force Schulze into the back seat of a car, pin her down and attack her, and then quickly drive away across the Champlain Bridge into Montreal. Incredibly, no police agency pursued the matter. Schulze's body is found the next day. She'd been strangled. Now, I don't have a whole lot of details on Ursula Schulze. What I'm focusing on here is the aftermath, the criminal investigative failure. An inquiry is called. The following year, the Quebec Police Commission, who has oversight of all police forces in Quebec, issues its report. And while praising the efforts of the on-the-ground constables, the report faulted the force director, Marcel Renaud, and his assistant director, Paul-Émile Blain, for, in quote, learning nothing, unquote, from the incident and failing to instruct force members on how to handle major crimes. Again, that was in quote. The report goes on to say the offhand manner of force superiors, coupled with the ignorance of force members on procedures and on how to use regional communication systems, severely hampered the investigation. And this report gets better, and I need to at this point just quote the whole thing. So it's lengthy, but believe me, it's worth it. Beginning quotes. The duty officer at the time did not order roadblocks or inform Quebec Provincial Police, QPP. And recall that the QPP at this time, that was the name for the Sûreté de Québec. They did not do this because this was not standard practice, in fact. In fact, there were no directives on what standard practice was in such a case. Other duty officers said they did not know that QPP headquarters was not cut in on the regional network used by municipal forces and thought that, quote, somebody else, unquote, had informed the QPP directly. The QPP were informed of the kidnapping 18 hours after it occurred. Blaine and the officer in charge of criminal investigation spent the day investigating a report of a robbery by 4 prison escapees, which he told the commission he judged the more serious of the cases. Both he and Director Renaud thought the QPP had been informed of the kidnapping and were investigating it. The girl's father testified that when he visited police headquarters the day of the kidnapping, he was told by Director Renaud that the criminal investigation branch had no time to investigate the kidnapping because they were occupied, quote, with more important matters, end quote. I know, seriously. I mean, what a fuck up, right? But hang on, there's more. Here, you ready for the punchline? Despite the lack of communication, despite the QPP not being informed about this until 18 hours later, the QPP managed to beat Renault and Blaine and the rest of the Brossard force to the crime scene of Ursula Schulze. So, what was the outcome of a lot of this? Well, I can tell you that shortly after this, there was a wave of consolidation of regional Quebec forces. Most, like the Lennoxville and the Cotacook forces in the eastern townships, got swallowed up under the umbrella of the Sûreté de Québec. In the case of Brossard, they merged with the Longueuil police, and you need to only talk to the Pare family, the Sharon Pare family, to understand the Longueuil police's special brand of dysfunction. But really, quite seriously, the lack of communication very clearly there was the issue, especially the initial phases of the missing persons investigation. One would have hoped that the Quebec Police Commission would have made recommendations to address this failure. So did they? Well, if you read your history, apparently not. As many of you are aware, this case and that of Alice Pare should sound frighteningly familiar. So let's jump forward to a case I've referred to before, and you know what? One of these days I'll do a full episode on Cédrica Provencher. So let's again look at Provencher because it's such a touchstone for so many of these matters. So it's July 31st, 2007, and 9-year-old Provencher disappears one afternoon from her neighborhood in Trois-Rivières. And while the police, they're merely, as far as they're willing to go, is to say that she is, quote, missing. The media immediately believed that she had been kidnapped. And this despite reports that Cédrica had been seen by a man searching for what he claimed his lost dog. And despite overwhelming evidence that she had been abducted, her bicycle was found in an alleyway blocks away. So finally, over a week later, on August 8th, the Sûreté de Québec finally issued a wanted notice for Cédrica. It took them over a week to actually put out the poster with her face on that, disparu Cédrica Provencher. But again, the poster initially suggested that she had voluntarily run away. So 36 years after Alice Pare, 35 years after Ursula Schulze, the Quebec police had learned absolutely nothing. Recall that in the Pare case, they had suggested she'd been a runaway when the family knew what had happened. So just to dovetail back and stitch all of this together, one of the initial outcomes of the Provencher disappearance was this a concerted effort by people like Senator Pierre Boisvenu. He called on the Sûreté de Québec to create a special squad to deal with missing persons in the first 48 hours of disappearances so that communication errors like this didn't ever happen again. But wait a minute, just back up. Shouldn't that have been the outcome 40 years earlier of the Schulze inquiry? 46 years has passed since the disappearance and murder of Alice Pare. And it's as if we've learned absolutely nothing in Quebec. It's it's not funny. I want to leave you with a couple of things, although, as I say, I'm not convinced of a connection with these cases to the prior on to leaky cases. Nevertheless, there's some things of interest that are worth pointing out. She's definitely of interest in the case of Sharon Pare, just in terms of the proximity in time, 1971 to, in the case of Pare, 75 prior. And also in terms of the proximity of the victim's age, Pare 14, Sharon Pryor 16. And then likewise, Ursula Schulze is also of interest to Pryor in terms of proximity in time, 1972-75, but also in terms of geography, Brassard, which is just adjacent to Longueuil. And just a few other things to note here. So who's found in wooded areas? Allure, Pryor, Camerin, Houle, Dorian, Dubé, and certainly Pare. Partially clothed or clothing removed but close to the body. Well, that's Pare, that's Pryor, that's Dubé, that's Camerin, that's Bézinet. Missing identification. Camerin, Monast, Hawks, Blay, Allure, Bézinet. In the case of Allure, my sister, it's not missing, but it's tossed by the side of the road 10 miles away, so it's removed from the proximity of the victim. And in some sense, you could say that of Pare too. I mean, I think a 14-year-old girl might not have a wallet, but certainly her flute case was an identifier, and you might want to separate that from the victim in order to give you maybe greater longevity in which to be caught, possibly. I don't know. The only thing I can say about this is, could they... look, the longevity of a timeline of... you can go on and on and on with these. You just kind of go, oh, strangulation, they're connected. But the longevity of an offender begins to come into question when you start with Pare in 71, and I even know some people who try to go all the way up to connect the dots to 2007 and Cédric Provencher. Sorry, that's a bridge too far for me. But it is interesting. Pare to Pryor to Schulze, possibly. You might have an offender there with the break in time between 72 to 75 who was incarcerated or who had traveled for some reason out of the province of Quebec, or many times they go to other regions of Quebec, the Gaspé, for instance, for a period of years, then come back to a more urban environment of Montreal, Sherbrooke. So that's a possibility. Going to close with some housekeeping items. First off, I'll attach some visuals to this episode. I have quite extensive visuals on the Pare case. Also, I go into length about other issues that I didn't really want to particularly cover on this podcast. So if you want to read more, you can read more at theresaallore.com, TheresaAllore.com. That's the Teresa Allure website where I'll post this podcast. In addition, I have my personal Twitter account, which is at JusticeGuy, JUSTUSGUY. But I've also started a exclusively Teresa Allure, the podcast, Twitter handle. And that's just at Teresa Allure, at TheresaAllore, for more specifics about matters to do with crime and such. A listener from the UK very kindly sent me the 4 reviews from iTunes UK, which were she said, I think you should read this because they're nice. And they were nice. Thank you, United Kingdom. That's very nice of you. I was heartened by that. And that's a great introduction to say, if you like what you hear, I would appreciate a nice review on iTunes. It creates more interest. Obviously, the more people who are aware of this, the greater the advocacy. I'm not shilling just for my resolution to my sister's homicide. Obviously, we have many homicides here, but many troubling justice issues, and awareness always helps. There is a website, there's a YouTube channel if you want to see film footage related to any of these matters, if you go to YouTube and search on Teresa Lore, Who Killed Teresa, you'll find it that way. And then there's a Facebook group, Who Killed Teresa, the podcast. You can follow along there, and I'll occasionally post things of interest. Anyway, we're at the hour, I see, so I think I will end it with that. On this Memorial Day weekend, 2017. Thank you for listening to Who Killed Teresa. I've been your host, John Allure. Have yourself a great afternoon.